accepted by other people around the world and by other nation states. And yet the image that the Westerner, specifically the European and the American, has of Japan is very much a Lafcadio Hearn image still of this nostalgic folktale, pretty little country where everybody is so mysterious and strange. And to me, the Japanese are not mysterious and strange. So the gap between Hearn's view of Japan and the Japan of 100 years ago is similar to the gap which exists now in the Western consciousness and exists here in this country.
The name of Lafcadio Hearn is known and revered throughout Japan as the greatest interpreter of that country's way of life for the Western world. His writings on the history, folklore, and customs of Japan in the 19th century have become school textbooks for generations of Japanese students, and the places he lived in have become centers of pilgrimage. Yet the name of Lafcadio Hearn is hardly known outside Japan, nor in Ireland, where he spent his early years. Patricio Lafcadio Hearn was born on the 27th of June, 1850, on the Greek island of Lefkas, then called Santa Mora, the second son of Rosa Antonia Casimati, a Greek woman, and Charles Bush Hearn, a surgeon in the British Army stationed on the island during the Crimean War. Charles Bush Hearn came from Anglo-Irish stock with a strong tradition of service in the church and the army. According to family tradition, the Hearns had gypsy blood in their veins. Lafcadio reflected this tradition in his life of travel and wandering. In 1850, Charles Bush Hearn was transferred to the West Indies. Before his departure to his next posting, he sent via Malta and Liverpool both his wife Rosa and their 2-year-old son to Dublin to stay with his mother, Mrs. Elizabeth Holmes Hearn, at 48 Lower Gardner Street. While life was comfortable in Ireland, Rosa was miserable. She spoke no English, and coming from a warm, dry and sunny climate, she found the damp weather of Ireland too harsh and the alien atmosphere of the conservative Home Hearn family too restricting. Before long, Rosa and Patricio, now called Patrick Lafcadio, moved to the residence of Mrs. Home Hearn's sister, Mrs. Sarah Brennan, at 21 Leinster Square, Rathmines. In 1853, Charles Hearn returned to Ireland to find his wife ill and deeply unhappy with her sojourn in Dublin. She returned to Greece, where even the birth of another son, Daniel James, in 1854, failed to save the marriage. Charles remarried and left for a new posting in India, and young Lafcadio was left in the care of his grandaunt, Mrs. Brennan, who had no children. He was never to see either parent again. Sarah Brennan, unlike the rest of the family, was a convert to Roman Catholicism. She took to the little olive-skinned, dark-eyed child with the strange name. But she was a strict disciplinarian who often locked the boy in his bedroom at night, where his active imagination conjured up ghosts and goblins. The young Lafcadio was introduced to the stories of the housemaid, Kate Myden, and those of the fishermen he met on his holidays in Tramore. At the age of 13, his aunt sent him to St. Cuthbert's College in Ushaw, England, a Jesuit public school on the slopes of the Yorkshire Hills. By all accounts, the school days of this delicate boy with poor eyesight were unhappy, and the only subjects he excelled at were English and French. As a result of an accident in the playground, he lost the sight of his left eye in 1866. On leaving school, he went to London, where he spent a year in poverty before traveling to the United States of America in 1869 on the proceeds of a small inheritance from Ireland. He would never return to Europe. "19 and penniless, Hearn settled in Cincinnati. Ambitious to become a writer, he soon got a job in a backstreet printing press, sleeping in a hayloft by night. Soon, using the name Lafcadio Hearn, he began to write stories and articles for the cheap weekly newspapers and was nicknamed the Raven because of his dark looks and brooding temperament. He wrote about the nightlife and the seedy world of the back streets for the Cincinnati Enquirer, establishing a reputation as a reporter of murders and other harrowing subjects. In a more literary vein, he translated the works of Gautier and Flaubert from the French, and with Henry Farney, published a short-lived newspaper called Ye Gig Lamps. Now living in a boarding house, he became involved with a maidservant who worked there.
Lafcadio Hearn was married in the United States, in the state of Ohio, to a black woman who already had a child from a previous liaison. However, the state of Ohio did not legally recognize interracial marriage at the time, so legally he wasn't married. But he left that woman, and in fact, I think she followed him around for quite a while. I think she even followed him at one time to New Orleans, all the way from Cincinnati. But he didn't want to take that up again.
In 1877, having spent 8 years in Ohio, Hearn sailed down the Mississippi to New Orleans, partly for health reasons, but also to write about Louisiana politics. He got a job as a reporter on the New Orleans Item, writing about foreign literature and events. Having saved some money, he opened a restaurant, but it survived for less than a month. Hearn's partner in the venture absconded with the cash and the cook, leaving him to pay the debts. In New Orleans, he lived at various addresses, ending up in Canal Street, now called Cleveland Avenue. He continued to devote much of his time to translating the works of French writers, such as Zola, Maupassant, and Pierre Loti, whose Madame Chrysanthemum greatly stimulated his interest in Japan. He also found the time to produce a dictionary of Creole proverbs, as well as a cookery book, La Cuisine Créole. Hearn survived as a journalist, covering various topics for the New Orleans newspaper, and taking a special interest in the 1885 New Orleans exhibition, which featured a Japanese pavilion. In June 1887, he embarked for Saint-Pierre on Martinique Island, where he was to write 2 years in the French West Indies, an account of the lazy tropical life he enjoyed there. Following an illness, he returned to the United States in 1889, spending some time in Philadelphia and in New York, where he heard from his younger brother, Daniel James.
He lost contact with his brother when they were both small, and the brother emigrated to America and ended up in Ohio. Just before Hearn was about to set sail for Japan, he received a letter from his brother, and the brother said, "I have seen your articles in a newspaper. I believe you're my brother. I would love to meet you." And Hearn said, "Well, that's fine. Show me proof that you are my brother." And the brother sent a photograph of their father and added some vague recollections of their early youth. And certainly Hearn realized that this was his real brother. He wrote a letter just before he left. He said, "Yes, you are my brother, but I don't want to see you. I don't want to meet you. I'm going to Japan, so goodbye." And he left for Japan without seeing his brother.
Hearn, frustrated and disillusioned in New York, accepted a Harper's Magazine assignment to travel to Japan. On April 13, 1890, Lafcadio Hearn, accompanied by illustrator Charles D. Weldon, landed in Yokohama, having departed from Vancouver on St. Patrick's Day aboard the SS Abyssinia. He took the advice of a friend who told him to write down his very first impression of Japan.
There is some charm unutterable in the morning air, cool with the coolness of Japanese spring and wind waves from the snowy cone of Fuji. A charm perhaps due rather to softest lucidity than to any positive tone, an atmospheric limpidity extraordinary, with only a suggestion of blue in it, through which the most distant objects appear focused with amazing sharpness. Elfish everything seems, for everything as well as everybody is small and queer and mysterious. The little houses under their blue roofs, the little shop fronts hung with blue, and the smiling little people in their blue costumes.
Captain Mitchell MacDonald, paymaster of the U.S. Navy stationed in Yokohama, gave Hearn a letter of introduction to Professor Basil Hall Chamberlain of the Department of English Literature at the Imperial University of Tokyo. Chamberlain helped Hearn to get an appointment as an English teacher at the normal and middle school at Matsue in the province of Izumo, known today as Shimane Prefecture. He arrived in Matsue in August 1890. His first year there, teaching and absorbing the ancient customs and heritage of the city, was one of the happiest of his life. This was the year in which he wrote Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan, a long eulogy to the Japanese way of life, customs, and traditions.
At this moment, there comes to me the recollection of a queer story told by a lady of Yokohama about one of her Japanese servants. My Japanese nurse came to me the other day, smiling as if something very pleasant had happened, and said that her husband was dead, and that she wanted permission to attend his funeral. I told her she could go. It seems they burned the man's body. Well, in the evening, she returned and showed me a vase containing some ashes of bones. I saw a tooth among them, and she said, "That's my husband." And she actually laughed as she said it. Did you ever hear of such disgusting creatures? It would have been quite impossible to convince the narrator of this incident that the demeanor of her servant, instead of being heartless, might have been heroic and capable of a very touching interpretation.
In 1891, Lafcadio Hearn married a Japanese woman, Setsu Koizumi, the daughter of a noble samurai family who had looked after him during an illness. They set up home in the shadow of Matsue Castle, the ancient seat of the former daimyo, or lord. Their new home was close to the schools, and Lafcadio derived great pleasure from the fine garden.
No effort to create an impossible or purely ideal landscape is made in the Japanese garden. Its artistic purpose is to copy faithfully the attractions of a veritable landscape and to convey the real impression that a real landscape communicates. It is therefore at once a picture and a poem, perhaps even more a poem than a picture. For as nature's scenery in its varying aspects affects us with sensations of joy or of solemnity, of grimness or of sweetness, of force or of peace, so must the true reflection of it in the labor of the landscape gardener create not merely an impression of beauty, but a mood in the soul.
Hearn, by this time, had adopted Japanese dress, but he still did not speak the language, relying on his wife, Setsu, to collect and relate to him the folk tales and mythology of the people.
だいたいこの地方はその神話がですね、日本国中の神話が非常に3分の2ぐらい集まってるところ、それから民謡のメッカなんですね。だからそういうような関係でもですね、いろんなつながり、特にラフカディオ・ハーン。
About two-thirds of Japanese mythology originated in Matsue and is regarded as a mecca of Japanese folk songs. It is said that Lafcadio Hearn was a Panseth, and this city is known as the City of God, which Lafcadio Hearn loved.
Today in Matsue, thousands flock to the Lafcadio Hearn Museum, which contains memorabilia and early editions of his writings on Japan.
This museum was established in 1985, but former museum is established in 1933, and a quarter million people, a quarter million tourists visit this museum once a year. One more, his name is famous in Japan. I'm very happy to live in Matsue and very happy to meet many tourists to visit this museum. And I recognize Lafcadio Hearn is one of the folklorists in Japan.
When his contract at Matsue expired, Hearn left for the city of Kumamoto, where he had been appointed to the new teaching post at the 5th Higher School, now the University of Kumamoto. After the delights of Matsue with its rivers, gardens and parks, Kumamoto on the island of Kyushu was a severe disappointment to Hearn. It was an ugly, commonplace, half-Europeanized garrison town, which to Hearn represented the worst of Japan's westernization. On the 17th of September, 1893, their first child, a son, was born and given the name Leopold Kazuo Koizumi. The following year, the Koizumi family were on the move again, this time to the city of Kobe, an open port opposite Osaka. Here, Hearn acquired the post of journalist on the Kobe Chronicle. His family survived a cholera epidemic, but along with his own persistent ill health came a growing disillusionment at the increasing westernization of the traditional Japanese way of life and a disgust at Japan's going to war with China. Meanwhile, he was busy publishing collections of essays on life in Japan, interpreting the mysteries of the Orient for an ever-curious Western audience.
Many Buddhist names, both of creatures and of plants, are ghostly. A pretty green grasshopper is called Hotoke Uma, or Buddha horse, the head of the insect curiously resembling the head of a horse in shape. But the word Hotoke also means the spirit of a dead person, all good persons being supposed by popular faith to become Buddhas. And the real meaning of the name Hotoke Uma is the horse of the dead. Now, during the great 3 days festival of the dead in the 7th month, it is believed that many spirits revisit their homes or their former friends, either with the help of insects or actually in the form of insects. The name of this grasshopper really implies that it is used as a horse by the shadowy visitors.
In 1896, Hearn became a Japanese citizen to protect his family. He took his wife's name, by which he is still known today in Japan, Yakumo Koizumi. During this time, he was offered a respectable salary, lecturing at the Imperial University of Tokyo, and he settled in the suburb of Ushigome. He gave 14 lectures a week and received dozens of social invitations, most of which he declined, preferring to spend his time with his by now enlarged family or writing. While living in Tokyo, Lafcadio Hearn wrote 12 books on Japan, including the very popular Kaidan, Stories of the Supernatural. In 1902, he moved again, this time to the Tokyo suburb of Nishi-Okubo. Lafcadio and Setsu had 4 children, 3 sons, Kazuo, who was born in Kumamoto in 1893, Iwo in 1897 in Tokyo, Kiyoshi in 1899, and his daughter Suzuko in September 1903.
特に子供たちのために一生懸命
He was very eager about education for his children. He tried to bring his children up in a Japanese way.
基本的に
At that time, Japanese education did not respect freedom and individuality. He was afraid of these aspects of education in Japan.
Hearn gave his eldest son, Kazuo, private lessons in English by writing words and sentences on old newspapers from the time the boy was 5 years old. Lafcadio was quite skillful in drawing, and he often drew sketches in Indian ink. He was invited to lecture at Cornell University, but the poor state of his health and failing eyesight prevented him from taking up the offer. In what were to be the final months of his life, he worked furiously on a collection of essays under the title Japan, an Attempt at Interpretation, a work that was to be the culmination of his writing career. In March 1903, Lafcadio Hearn resigned from the Imperial University of Tokyo because, as a Japanese citizen, he would in future be paid a considerably lower salary than he was already receiving. In the spring of 1904, the private university of Waseda invited him to lecture on English literature to classes of aspiring writers and journalists. In some of his lectures, he introduced his Japanese students to the riches of Irish writing, ranging from Swift and Berkeley to modern writers like Samuel Ferguson and William Butler Yeats. Patricio Lafcadio Hearn died on the 27th of September 1904 and was buried in Zoshigaya Cemetery in Tokyo, according to the elaborate Buddhist funeral rite. The wanderer had found his resting place. His widow, Setsu, remarked that he had liked to pronounce his own surname Heron rather than Hearn. In this and throughout his nomadic life, he had taken to heart the motto on the family crest: the heron seeks the heights.
I think looking at him in the context of the era that he was in certainly justifies a great deal of attention to his career, to what he was trying to do, and to how the Japanese view him and how Westerners view them, although he's virtually unknown in the West, so I think hardly one could say that Westerners have any adoration for him. I don't think that adoration for Lafcadio Hearn is justified as a writer, but as a phenomenon, as the man who came to Japan and wrote about things Japanese and assimilated the vanishing Japan in all of its good aspects and its bad aspects. I think certainly Lafcadio Hearn deserves a great deal of attention and scrutiny.
I believe Lafcadio Hearn made a certain contribution to Japanese history and literature at a time when it was emerging after hundreds of years of isolation. And his real contribution is that he articulated the culture of Japan for the West. In the United States, everyone was aware of the economic and material progress in Japan, but Hearn caught the spirit of the old Japan in its evanescence, and he gave it form and structure in superb prose. And I think for that contribution, he has been remembered.